guys, Drifter here. Today is the 10-year anniversary of my annual horror movie recommendations, and this year I've decided to do something a little bit different. This year I'm going to be recommending horror movies from around the world. We've mostly reviewed American horror movies in this series, but this year I wanted to share some new perspectives of fear. Sometimes it's even scarier to watch a movie from a different culture because you don't have any context for what's going on and cannot hope to water it down with an understanding of the tropes that you're all familiar with. As they say, the scariest thing of all is not knowing what comes next. All of my recommendations are extremely new, but mostly subtitled. All of this year's movies are available on Shudder except for one, and I want to let you know I am not sponsored by Shudder. I do highly recommend it as a streaming service, especially if you're a fan of horror movies. And without wasting any time, our first stop this year will be a layover in Senegal, which is located in West Africa. We're going to be starting this video strong with a recommendation for a 2021 Senegalese horror film called Saloum. This is a truly African horror movie with an African cast and directed by Congolese director Jean-Luc Herbold. Saloum touches on topic of horror directly related to the consequences of war in Africa, and its supernatural villains are ancient African gods that operate on an entirely different type of magical logic than what we're used to. It's a film that opens a window into a culture that not many of us watching this video know very much about, and given that lack of knowledge, it also maintains a very high degree of unpredictability from beginning to end. The basic plot summary of this film is very similar to From Dusk Till Dawn. It follows an infamous group of mercenaries during the 2003 Guinea-Bissau attempted coup d'etat. The mercenaries are hired to escort a high-value target, who happens to be a South American drug lord, out of the war zone and into a location for a safe drop-off. The location they choose is near the Senegalese Saloum River Delta, where they pose as tourists and meet a cast of suspicious locals. Even more suspiciously, many of the locals seem to recognize, or perhaps almost recognize, a particular member of the group. The first part of this film plays out like a slow-boiling crime drama. It's extremely well acted, and every character is fully realized, a lot like Reservoir Dogs. However, at about the halfway point, the group is discovered to actually be mercenaries instead of tourists, and one of the locals gets murdered. I don't want to spoil which one. Unfortunately, as it turns out, that local was in contract with a god older than history and language itself, and that character's death frees this ancient god from its binding. The second half of Saloum is essentially a creature feature where mercenaries and random tourists try to survive the wrath of this African god. It mostly takes the shape of a swarm of flies that can kill you in seconds or even possess your body. Even though it's a spiritual entity, it still has its own rules and odd weaknesses that it operates under, and a type of logic that we're not very familiar with here in the West. The creature itself reminds me a lot of the depiction of Beelzebub from the Bible, you know, the Lord of Flies. And that's all I want to do for plot summary to avoid spoilers. Anything more than that might ruin the end of the movie. So let's talk about the merits of this movie. Saloum was made on a budget less than what you probably spent on your last car, but it looks like $1 million. The director and cinematographer look like they absolutely knew what they wanted to do and executed it perfectly. It is a gorgeous looking film, and it doesn't suffer from any of the flaws of your typical low-budget filmmaking like lighting issues, wonky sound, or bad special effects. I'm of the opinion that Hollywood couldn't make something like this for anything less than $10 million. As I mentioned before, it's extremely well acted, especially the main lead, Jan Gale, who I hope to God I'm pronouncing that right. All of the characters in this are very well developed and have their own unique character traits. Another extremely impressive performance is the female lead by Evelyn Illy-Juhen, hopefully I'm saying that right too, who has to deliver most of her performance via sign language because she plays a character whose ears were mutilated during a previous civil war. The real horror of this movie isn't the god of the flies that they have angered, but rather that most of the characters are suffering from traumas that allude to real wars. It gives you a window into some of the real horrors of the world that don't typically make it onto American news, like human trafficking, child abuse, mutilations, and other unpleasant things like that. Of all of the films that I'm going to recommend this year, I most strongly recommend Saloum. It is nothing shy of excellent. Our second stop this year will be in the beautiful city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, the setting of the film Terrified, or Aterrados, directed by Demian Runga, who we'll talk a little bit about today. But Terrified is a 2017 Argentinian supernatural horror film directed by Demian Runga, who you might recognize as the director of When Evil Lurks. This is the film before When Evil Lurks, and it is every bit as terrifying. No pun intended. I really want to emphasize that of all the films I'm reviewing today, this one is probably the most genuinely scary and probably the hardest one to watch for most people. The broad strokes plot of Aterrados, or Terrified, is that it features a large cast of characters that are coming together to try to solve a series of supernatural murders. And by supernatural, I don't just mean you see the crime scene or somebody has a heart attack when they see the ghost. I mean, in the first few minutes, you're going to get to see a ghost brutally murder people, with emphasis here on the brutality. Almost all of the plot takes place in and around a very mundane apartment complex in a very normal neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Argentina. As unexplainable accidents begin to pile up, a police detective, paranormal investigators, and the residents of the apartment complex themselves all come together to try to save their neighborhood from whatever this existential threat is. This, unfortunately, does come with the downside of there being a lot of character threads to follow and some shifting perspectives, but I don't think that majorly detracts from the movie. The thing that really stands out about Terrified is the design of the murderous ghost. It is a truly alien being compared to what you would expect, much like how the demons in When Evil Lurks operate on an unexpected and never-before-seen logic. The ghost in Terrified is nothing like any ghost that you have ever even imagined. I'd wager it may not even be a ghost as much as a proper extra-dimensional being, because as a small spoiler, it seems to be able to travel into our world via cracks and reflections in mirrors. Its behavior is more comparable to a Lovecraftian monster than it is to a traditional specter. I think that Terrified is downright terrifying. Again, no pun intended. The film is just so unpredictable and violent that it makes you really empathize with the mostly reasonable cast of characters that are just trying to figure out what in the world is going on. Of note, and this is why it's hard to watch, children die in this movie in some pretty brutal ways. It can be a hard watch, so if you're not okay with children dying, I would really recommend you skip this one. To speak on the merits of Terrified, it looks fantastic for being filmed on a budget of peanuts, and it's also extremely well acted. The special effects are mostly subtle ones, but they are effective. However, the gore special effects are extremely realistic. It looks like a movie that should cost 10 times as much as it actually did to produce. It was actually so successful that the director, Demian Runga, would later go on to make When Evil Lurks, and he may also be the upcoming director to the sequel to Alien Romulus. As of recording this video, that's just a rumor that is not confirmed yet, but I can only hope, because if the director of Terrified makes Alien Romulus, then Alien is actually going to be scary again. Our third stop on this journey around the world will be to Japan for One Cut of the Dead. One Cut of the Dead is a 2017 Japanese horror comedy film that is truly unique, even compared to the rest of the films that we're going to talk about today. If at all possible, please watch this movie going in blind. It has one of the best twists of any movie that I've ever seen in my entire life, and the only problem is that the twist doesn't come until about 30 minutes into the movie. The twist is so massive that it literally turns into a different film that is unrecognizable from the poster or trailer or anything that you may have seen. It's kind of rough though, because the first 30 minutes are intentionally bizarre. However, after this, after the initial twist, I should say, there will be a twist every 20 minutes and the movie will continually reset itself. Everything after this part of the review is going to be a massive spoiler, and I think this film is still very enjoyable after being spoiled, but it's downright magical if you go in blind. The last thing I will say before moving into what I'll call the true spoilers is that this supposed horror film would probably get a PG rating in the United States and be considered a family comedy. It is the only thing on this list you see here that I'm going to even remotely recommend for children. So if you don't want it spoiled, check out now. Okay, let's talk spoilers. You, as the viewer, will start off watching a movie about a crazy director who's trying to make a one-shot zombie movie, but the crew gets attacked by real zombies. Since the director loves realism, he's not gonna stop filming, but it plays out kind of like a really bad and really weird movie, almost like a so bad it's good, best of the worst, you want to laugh at it for being dumb kind of thing. And then weirdly, at the 30-minute mark, the movie entirely ends, and there's a hard break that flashes back to 3 months ago. The flashback is filmed normally and looks much more like a normal movie, which focuses on a down-on-his-luck director. This director usually makes commercials and very low-budget TV productions, and he's also struggling with some family dynamics, including his daughter, who is herself an aspiring director, but is a little bit too much of a try-hard for most people to work with. Almost out of nowhere, this down-on-his-luck director is given the chance of a lifetime to make a one-cut zombie movie for the new Zombie TV channel. And the next chunk of this movie is about the director planning, hiring cast, hiring crew, creating scripts, and creating the film that you watched in the first 30 minutes. This part plays out a lot like a Disney Channel family comedy, and it slowly starts to explain all of the bizarre things that you saw in the first 30 minutes of the movie. The next twist is then it then cuts to the live take itself, which goes horribly wrong, so the crew is forced to adapt on the fly. But you, as the audience, are now seeing a live failure from the crew's perspective. The movie rapidly turns into a pure comedy of errors, and it's all about the shenanigans that the crew has to go through to keep this production alive. The movie becomes really wholesome because this director's family steps up to fill in the void for crew members that have been disabled due to comical things like diarrhea or food allergies. Then, out of all of that, the last 5 to 10 minutes of the movie is the credits that reveal that the live zombie movie that you saw in the beginning, in the filming of the live zombie movie that you saw in the beginning, and then the filming of the filming of the filming of the movie that you saw in the beginning was all done in one real take by hidden crews. It literally ends up being almost 5 layers deep of a one-take film, meaning not only did they have to rehearse and plan for the initial one take, but the second one take, and then the third one take, and then just enough to make credits and keep everybody off of the camera, because there are so many hidden layers going on. I think this is an insanely impressive production for a film that had a budget of a meager $25,000. It'll also make you feel good at the end. Almost unlike everything else on this list, I think it's a great family movie to show people, especially if they don't know anything about it. The hardest part of this movie is getting anybody to sit through the first 30 minutes, which is admittedly very bad and very confusing, but on purpose. Our next to last stop this year will be in medieval Europe for The Ugly Stepsister. The Ugly Stepsister is a 2025 European co-production between Norway, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark that is essentially a dark retelling of the classic Cinderella story. You could also adequately describe it as a medieval version of The Substance, which was extremely popular this past year. I don't think I'm going to have to worry about spoilers on this because it sticks pretty closely to the original Cinderella story, albeit with less magic and from a different perspective. Unlike the previous review, this one is definitely not a kid's film. It would actually best be described as a body horror film. The Ugly Stepsister is told from the perspective of one of Cinderella's evil stepsister. This particular stepsister isn't inherently bad or evil. She is, in many ways, a victim of the wicked stepmother's cruelty, and the wicked stepmother has been marrying men for money and killing them for years. Unfortunately, her latest victim, Cinderella's father, was dead broke, so her scheme left her inheriting a large amount of debt instead of a substantial estate. Since she's too old to remarry again herself, the wicked stepmother plans to make her ugliest daughter more beautiful and marry her off to a rich prince that lives nearby, or really any royalty for that matter. The wicked stepmother essentially enslaves Cinderella and forces her to attend to her ugly daughter and to help beautify her. A huge portion of this movie focuses on very real medieval beautification techniques that real women had to endure in real life. The Ugly Stepsister is forced to break her nose to reshape it to be prettier, get barbaric eyelash implants, and subject herself to tapeworm weight loss. The tapeworm is often presented as something of an anti-fairy or the opposite of the magical fairy that would help Cinderella, and is quite nasty at that. The beautification process is successful and the ugly stepsister does indeed become beautiful, but have you ever heard of the phrase beauty is pain? In her case, she's paying for this beauty with extreme pain and long-term damage to her body, and she's also being forced to learn abusive habits from the aristocrats that she then lays down upon Cinderella. This all leads to the climax at the ball, much like the Cinderella story, and when the prince comes looking for petite feet that fit into these glass slippers, the ugly stepsister is forced to do something truly horrible for herself in order to try to win his love. What's interesting about this movie is that neither Cinderella nor Prince Charming are particularly good. The prince is especially crummy, vain, and kind of demeaning to women, so even the prize that the ugly stepsister is trying to win is ultimately a life of servitude under an unworthy and unloving partner. This is a very real fate that a lot of medieval women met. The themes and imagery of The Ugly Stepsister are very similar to that of The Substance, which is to say that it's about how society brutalizes women for the sake of beauty and for marriage. The scary thing to me is to know that not much has changed over the last 600 years. So if you enjoyed The Substance earlier this year, you'll probably also enjoy this movie as well. I personally found its body horror kind of hard to deal with, a little bit harder than The Substance, knowing that it was all very real instead of just fantasy. One final warning before watching this movie is that I'd like to point out that it is a very slow-paced movie, and it's designed to be a slow burn. Don't expect it to hit hard and fast. The last film that we're going to be talking about this year is 2025's Sinners. Surprise, the last film on our list is from America, just not the part of the USA that most of y'all are familiar with. This final film comes from the Mississippi Delta, which is where I'm from, which I assure you is an entirely different world compared to the rest of the country. So we're going to be talking about Sinners, which is a 2025 Ryan Coogler directed, and it stars Michael B. Jordan in dual roles. This is a film that many of you are probably already familiar with because it was extremely popular at the box office this year and is probably going to be up for numerous Oscar nominations. Sinners takes place in Clarksdale, Mississippi in 1932. This would be the height of the Jim Crow era where segregation was legally mandated. I grew up in a small town called Greenwood, Mississippi, which is not that far from Clarksdale, and let me tell you, it hasn't changed much since 1932. Part of the horror of Sinners is that it explores the consequences of legally mandated segregation and racial violence. This is a film that hit home for me because while segregation was no longer mandated for me because I was there in the 90s and 2000s, it was still very much so enforced by society. I kid you not, I'm not making this up. I literally went to a segregated high school, I ate at segregated restaurants, and shopped at whites-only stores. To drive this point home even further, some members of my family were personally familiar with both Emmett Till and his murderers. I grew up hearing stories from this alternative history where Emmett Till's murderers were heroes and Emmett Till himself was evil and deserved it. We're going to circle back around to this personal trauma of mine in a few minutes, but for now, let's talk about the basic plot of Sinners. The plot of Sinners is that two brothers who stole money from Al Capone return to the rural South in order to open up a juke joint for the black community. There is horror and conflict in a society that makes it difficult for African Americans to purchase or own anything, and then as a small spoiler, vampires attack the juke joint on opening night. It's kind of funny that this year we have two predominantly black films that borrow a lot of the plot structure from Dusk Till Dawn. I also found it interesting that the film's villain, who's Irish, is portrayed as deeply sympathetic and not even racist. The lead vampire that spreads the infection and controls the larger group that attacks the juke joint is from 900 AD Ireland, where he tells stories of also experiencing oppression and genocide. Even though murderous, the villain considers himself to be freeing African Americans from their oppressors and freeing the white people from their own bigotry. To him, dead is dead, and race just doesn't matter anymore. It's a totally different type of society, I guess. Sinners is extraordinarily well acted, with Michael B. Jordan absolutely nailing his dual roles. Its cinematography is second to none, and if Sinners wins an Oscar this year, my guess is that it would be because of this amazing dance scene at about the halfway point, where one of the characters sings a blues song so powerful that it's able to not only summon ghosts of the past, but also ghosts of the future. It's the main musical number in the movie that features a whole ton of famous African-American musicians from both the past and the present appearing in this tiny little juke joint in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and seemingly blending in with its patrons. The movie has a lot of cool special effects relating to vampires, but this particular dance scene was impressive on an entirely different level. There's also an extremely impressive special effects scene that happens early on where Michael B. Jordan is able to convincingly pass a cigar to himself in these dual roles. It's a subtle and almost blink if you miss it kind of moment, but the design is impeccable and it shows off some truly amazing special effects works that contribute to helping you think that these are two different people. The first half of this movie is building tension, introducing characters, and setup, while the second half is an all-out vampire assault. The first half takes its time for you to really understand why these characters are here and why they're setting up this juke joint and why they desperately need to open as soon as possible, and it really invests you into their ambitions. The horror of the first half is their experience with segregation, and I think the film did a masterful job at showing what life was actually like during that time. All the little nuances of characters' movements and stances when dealing with members of opposite races is extremely accurate. Now, I wasn't there in 1932. Growing up in even the modern Mississippi Delta, you will be taught rules as to how to interact with your own race and different rules for interacting with other races. There are a bunch of different unspoken rules for interacting, let's say black people versus Chinese people versus white people, etc. For example, the black people had their own part of town, their own currency, which was kind of like slave script, and in common areas like the train station, they would have different sides they would have to sit on. It could be, say, really embarrassing for a white woman to be seen in public talking to a black man, and extremely dangerous for that black man to be seen talking to a white woman in public. Black people essentially will have two vernaculars, one for talking amongst themselves and a second one for talking to white people. They even included some of the old Haitian voodoo magic that my mammy taught me when I was very young, and yes, my town was so out of date that my grandparents hired an actual mammy to raise me. If you know, you know, but that's a topic for a different video. Another thing that Sinners did with an impressive degree of accuracy is portraying the Chinese community in the Mississippi Delta as a sort of in-between. They could freely associate with members of either race and run stores that existed somewhat outside of segregation. My wife is actually Mississippi Delta Chinese as well and has nothing but praises for this movie in terms of how it portrays her ancestors, with one exception. The only thing they got wrong is that the Delta Chinese in the movie Sinners speak Mandarin, which would have been incredibly rare. Most of the Delta Chinese were Cantonese, which would be the dialect you would hear out of a lot of Hong Kong films. The second half of the film is very gory, very violent, and downright horrific. I have less to say about this part of the movie as it rapidly devolves into an all-out battle for survival against vampires that is strongly reminiscent of From Dusk Till Dawn. This is the part of the movie that delivers the goods that you paid for in an R-rated horror film. As a small spoiler that is literally irrelevant to the plot, there's also a Klan massacre near the end, and I gotta tell you, any movie that ends with 40 dead white supremacists is a good movie in my book. Also, keep an eye open for the post-credits scene. They added a Marvel movie-like post-credits scene that completely changes and recontextualizes the ending. Guys, that is all for this year's scary movie recommendations. I hope that you check out some of them. 4 out of 5 are available on Shudder. I think the 5th one, Sinners, is available obviously on digital, but also on HBO Max. Everything this year is nothing shy of amazing quality, cinematography, acting, filmmaking, and most of all, frights that you're just not expecting because you have no context for the culture that you're enjoying. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something useful. If you did, don't forget to like, favorite, and subscribe. Drifter out.